A lot of gardeners find pruning complicated, and I think one of the main reasons is that they know they should cut something, but they don't know why they're cutting. I find that once I understand why I'm cutting something, the pruning process is really easy and I understand where to prune and how much to prune. For this video, I went out to a bunch of neighborhoods and I took pictures of pruning problems in people's front yards. So these are real problems people have, and I'm going to explain the problem, why you should prune it, and how you should correct the problem. Now this will give you a good introduction to pruning, and you'll learn a lot in this video. But if you really want to learn how to prune, consider taking my course that covers everything about pruning. And it's on Udemy, so it's a pretty inexpensive online course that you can take any time of the year. I'll put a link to that course in the description below. Here's a juniper bush with a broken branch. I think the snowplow came through and caught the edge of the branch and knocked it off. Now it's pretty obvious here that you have to remove that branch. Some people try to tape it back in place and hope it grows, but there's no point in doing that. This is a shrubby plant and it grows back fairly easily, so just cut that off. But when should you cut this? When should you do pruning? Well, when you see damage like this, prune it right away. Doesn't matter what time of year it is. Get it cut, get the wound cleaned up. If you see any ragged edges, cut those off too, and the plant will start taking care of the cut. Now, woody plants don't heal the way we heal, but they do harden off the cut area and they separate the cut from the rest of the good wood. So there is a process that they go through. When you see damage like this, prune it right away. Don't wait. Normally, when you're doing your annual pruning, that's best done in late winter. Here's a small Weigelia bush. Doesn't look very healthy. There's only a few leaves on it, few empty stems. Well, what do you do with this? Well, the problem here is that there's too much shade. You can't see that in the picture, but to the right of this picture is a larger tree and it's shading this garden. And there's just too much shade for this plant. The ideal solution is to actually take it out of this spot and move it somewhere that's sunnier. But if you want to try to grow it here, what I would do is cut it way back. All these stems that have no leaves on them, it doesn't look good, and it's not really healthy for the plant. So I would cut it back to about 6-inch stubs and hope that the plant grows and fills in better. The other problem we have with this Weigelia is that some of it is reverting. So if we have a close-up of the leaves, you'll see that some are a nice kind of brown burgundy color, and others are quite green. The green leaves are reverting. The green color is the natural color of this plant, and it tries to go back to that color. If you think about these leaves, the more green they have, the more they can photosynthesize, the more food they grow for the plant, and the faster those green leaves grow. So green leaves almost always grow faster. We have to cut out all the green leaves, otherwise we'll lose the colored red leaves. Here's another Weigelia. This one is a variegated color, but again we have similar problems. It's kind of a scraggly shrub because it's really not getting enough light here, and probably it hasn't been pruned. But the other problem is there's also some reversion here. There's some green leaves in here, and we need to get those out. Otherwise, they'll take over. If you're walking around the neighborhood, and I encourage all of you to do that, just drive out to some neighborhood. It doesn't have to be your neighborhood. Walk down the street and look at the gardens and critique them. You'll learn a lot about what's going on. This here is a Euonymus fortunii, commonly called the winter creeper. It has this same problem of reversion. Now this one's a little fuller looking. I suspect it's getting more light, and it's also been pruned regularly into this ball shape. The problem here is that half the bush is now green and the other half is variegated. It should all be variegated. But these Euonymus, they have a tendency to revert quite regularly, and you pretty much have to come out every year and cut away the green stuff. So how do you do that? Well, grab the branch that has the green leaves and follow it back to a point where it's attached to the main stem, or where it's attached to a stem that has variegated leaves, and cut as much of that off as you can. Do that every year. In fact, I generally prune in late fall, and that's a great time to do this, but sometimes I even do it in spring because I want to get that green out of there. I don't want it growing all summer because it'll grow faster than the variegated part. Now, what about the shape of this shrub? It's this ball shape. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. If you like this shape in the garden, go ahead and prune it this way. But I think you'll find you'll enjoy the shrub better if you don't make it quite so round. It can have sort of an approximate round shape, but let each stem kind of grow on its own. Give it a little character. Balls in the garden don't really look that good. Here's a similar plant that's been pruned in a completely different shape. In this case, the shrub has been trained up against a rock wall. And these euonymus are really great for that. They're easy to trim in whatever shape you want. Now, what you need to do each year is come along and have a look at it. Keep the branches that are close to the wall, and anything that's growing out towards the camera, cut that off. We want side branches to fill out here, but we only want side branches that are going left and right. We don't want them coming towards us. Otherwise, the bush gets too big, and you don't get this nice growth along the rock. When you're pruning, it's always important to know what shape you're going for. And it doesn't really matter. That's a personal taste. You can grow this plant into a round ball. You can grow it into a very natural looking shrub. You can grow it in an espalier form like you have in this picture. All kinds of shapes are possible, and you get to decide what you want this plant to look like. Now, it's not a particularly fast-growing plant, so this will take a couple years, but as time goes by, this plant will look nicer and nicer. Here's a yellow form of this plant. It's been trimmed into more of a ball shape, but it's kind of a loose ball. It's not quite so tightly curved, and I think this is a little more natural looking. Now, unfortunately, this shrub has some weeds growing in here, so it looks like some grasses are growing. You have to get those out, and those can be kind of tough to get after. So what I recommend doing is at least every couple weeks, come along and have a look at this shrub, and if you see some of this grass, yank it out. Get down as deep as you can. Get your hand right inside the shrub. Find the roots. Try to get the roots out. Over time, you will get rid of the weed. Here's another reversion. Here we have a natural shrub that has a nice red coloration. And this isn't really its fall color. It has this color all year long. But some of the stems have reverted to green. This is a 9-bark. They're a great little shrub, easy to grow in colder climates. They come in a variety of different colors. And this dark burgundy color is particularly nice. But you can see the green leaves here. As I said before, green leaves photosynthesize better than red leaves. So the green leaves are going to make more food. There's going to be more food in the stems of the green leaves, and they're going to grow faster and faster. And if we leave this, the green will overtake the red. Now, this has been left far too long. I would say that a year or two ago, someone should have come in here and cut every bit of green out of here. And again, it's really important to cut way back to where the green starts. Don't just cut the tips off here. You want to follow these stems back right to the base of the plant and cut that out. Here we have another euonymus that is showing a bit of reversion, but not very much. Most of it is still variegated, but we have these skinny stems sticking up, and the plant does tend to do that. Many other shrubs will do this too. When do you prune those off? If you follow my rule of thumb, you would come along here in late winter and cut those back, and that works just fine. But sometimes in midsummer when I see these, I will come and trim them back in midsummer. The reason for that is that in spring, late spring, and early summer, these things are growing. And I don't really want the plant to put all its energy into growing a stem that I'm going to cut off anyways in late winter. And I also know that this is a pretty tough plant. I can pretty much cut it any time of the year and I'm not going to harm it. So my tendency here is to come along a couple times a year, cut these stems back to the right height, keep the shape that you want, and then come along in late winter and do a final trim and make sure it's all ready for the spring growth. Here's a different kind of reversion. This is on a maple tree. They're called harlequins, and they're a beautiful tree. Now this is a bit hard to see in this picture because there are only a few green leaves right inside the crown of the plant. But in the center of the picture, you'll see these leaves that are totally green. If you look off to the left, you'll see some variegated ones. The variegated leaves have some green and some yellow, and that's what the tree should look like. Here's a close-up of the harlequin maple, a beautiful leaf. The problem with these trees is they always revert. Sooner or later, this tree will form a branch as all green. As soon as you see that, cut it out, even if it's middle of summer. If you don't, you'll end up with something like this. This is a maple where 2/3 of the tree is harlequin, it's variegated, and a good 1/3 of the tree is solid green. And if we don't do anything with this tree, the green will just get larger and larger and overtake the whole tree. Now, what do you do about pruning in this case? Well, it's pretty much too late for this tree. If you want to correct this, you're going to have to come in and cut out some really large branches, and you probably have to hire an arborist to do that. With these kind of reversions, it's really important to catch them as soon as they start and to check the tree every year. This is not something you're going to do once and you're done for life. Harlequin maples are great looking, but I don't know if I've ever seen one that's a decent size that doesn't have some green reversion in it. So the advice is, even though it's a great looking tree, I wouldn't plant it because it's really hard to control this on larger trees. Here's a beautiful front yard garden. This person has a nice Japanese theme throughout his garden, and he's done an absolutely fabulous job out front. Most of the garden has been there for a couple years, and the tree in the middle of the picture has been there for a number of years. But this past year, he decided to put a new bed around the tree. Now, as far as the aesthetic design goes, I love it. 2 rectangles, one sitting inside the other, one's a little higher than the other. This is a really nice design. My only complaint about it is that he's raised the level of the soil around the trunk of the tree, and that's something you should never do. Although the design is aesthetically very pleasing, it's really not the best thing for that tree. Don't put soil around the trunk of the tree. You might have also heard that you shouldn't have mulch leaning up against the tree. Some people put a lot there, and that's called mulch volcanoes. Now, for a long time, we've been telling gardeners not to do that because it causes rot of the bark on the tree and eventually death of the tree. And that's been a myth that's floating around my whole life. It turns out that none of the experts in this field have ever seen a tree that has been killed by rotting bark. In fact, what happens is that the roots grow up into the mulch and create circulating roots, and that's what kills the tree. I have an article about that on my blog, gardenmyths.com, and you're welcome to go and read it. So the advice is don't put the mulch up against the tree, but the reason the tree dies is not because the bark rots. It's the circulating roots that are the problem. So our advice was correct, but our explanation was wrong. So one of the trees I spotted in the neighborhood looked like this. It was a really nice maple, a dark leafed maple, and the top of it had this one long branch sticking up. Now I knew right away what this is. This is an extra leader. So the top of the tree is actually on the left side of this picture. It's not this skinny thing. The left side branches should be growing taller, but for some reason this tree has made an extra branch grow even taller, and that's that skinny thing on the right. So the tree now has at least 2 leaders, and that's usually a problem for a tree. Now this is a larger tree, and we should correct the problem even on this larger tree, but the best time to catch these problems are on smaller trees. So I would have advised that you just simply cut this tip off. But what happened was that later on in the year I went back and had a second look at this tree, and once the leaves are off, you see a different problem. So this is a picture of the same tree a couple months later, and now you can see all the structure inside. Now there's a couple lessons here. The first one is that sometimes when the tree is covered in leaves, it hides the problem. So winter time is actually a great time to go out and look at your shrubs and trees and see if there's any problems you should be fixing next spring. You can see the tall leader on the right branch in this picture. And I've gone ahead to make this a little more obvious and added some lines to this. So we have a red line, which is the main leader of a tree. And many trees should only have one single leader. Now, most of the maples fall into that category. So the red line is the main central branch, if you like, the main central trunk of the tree. And that should be the tallest part of the tree. What this tree has done is it's taken a side branch that started quite far down, but it's now taller than the central one. And that's going to become a problem as this tree gets older. Now, trees are kind of funny. They try really hard to make the top bud grow as far up as it can. The taller it grows, the more dominant it becomes. And that tall branch actually makes hormones that it sends down to the rest of the branches and tells them, stop growing. I'm the tallest bud. I'm the one that's going to grow straight up. And you lower down, guys. I don't want you growing. Now, I'm not sure if the hormones from the branch on the right, the one marked in blue, will get all the way down to the trunk and up the other side. But those hormones certainly affect the branches below it. So how do we correct this problem? Well, as I said, this problem should have been corrected a long time ago, but we can still do something about this. This is not a large tree yet. So there are a couple of options. The first option is to simply cut off the top pieces of this branch. And I've shown that with a blue bar where I would cut these. I want to cut these branches shorter so that they're no longer the tallest branch in the tree. That will signal to the tree that most of the food should go up the main trunk, and the main trunk will get stronger and grow taller, and this side branch that has been cut back won't grow as well next year. Now, the other option is a little more drastic, and that is to cut it right back to where it started. This side branch is getting almost as thick as the main trunk, and we don't want that. There are really two problems with that approach. One is that you're going to leave a big hole on the side of this tree. And since this is a front yard tree, aesthetics is important here. We don't want to create a lopsided tree. Now, eventually over time, it will correct that lopsided look, but it's going to take a number of years for that to happen. And so for aesthetic reasons, we don't want to really cut it all out. The second reason why this is a poor cut is that we're going to have to cut quite a large stem. When we cut large stems, they seal off much less efficiently. It's going to take a long time for this tree to correct that cut. And so we always want to try to make the cuts as small as possible. So we have kind of an intermediate option, and that's shown with this blue line. Cut it back about halfway, and then keep an eye on it. This allows the main trunk to grow taller without interference from this side branch. The cut is much smaller, so it's going to do less damage to the tree. And there's enough side branches on this trunk to keep growing and fill in the space. So I think the tree will look much nicer. So this is the option that I would use in this tree. Now, if this tree was in my wood lot and I just wanted to correct the problem and aesthetics wasn't that important, I think I might take the whole branch out. Long term, that will give me the healthiest tree and one that needs the least amount of pruning year to year. Remember, if we only cut it back part way, we may have to come along in 3 or 4 years and do this again to correct the problem a second time. In this picture, we can see a couple trees. We have this large central tree that's dominating the front yard. And then to the right of it, we have a much smaller tree. It looks pretty green, but there are some dead branches in here. And if we zoom in a bit, we can see the dead part of the tree quite clearly. Now, this smaller tree is actually a lilac that's been pruned to grow on a single stem. This is a Korean lilac, and they normally grow as bushes. So you'd have several stems coming up from the ground, and you'd have a typical bush shape. But in this case, we've created a standard. And the word standard is used when we take a shrub and prune it so that it has a single stem. We make it look like a tree, and that's a standard. If we have a closer look, we see that there's quite a bit of dead wood in here. Only the outer regions of this have leaves. Now, the reason for this is that this little tree is just not getting enough sun now. It's quite an old tree, so it's probably been doing well for a number of years, but this will never be a tall tree. These standards will always be on the short side. The main tree has grown really tall, has many more branches now, many more leaves, and it's shading this smaller tree. So what do we do in this case? Well, we could go in and do some pruning here and cut out all the dead wood, but that doesn't really solve the problem. The big tree is going to continue to get bigger and bigger every year, and this lilac is going to do worse and worse every year. Now, one option is to bring in an arborist and trim the big tree, thin it out, so that we get more light coming in. But that's a big job, and I don't think it's a good option. Another option is that we could dig up the lilac and move it. Put it in the backyard where it's nice and sunny. And that can work. The problem with this lilac is that it's pretty old already. You can see by the trunk that it's a pretty mature plant. And this is going to have a large root system. We're going to do a lot of damage to the root system. And it's going to take a number of years for this thing to recover. And it just might die anyways. So the third option is to simply take it out and don't worry about it. And that's probably the best option. Now, I grow these lilacs in my gardens, but I grow them as shrubs. So mine have multiple trunks coming up. If one of my shrubs was growing too close to a larger tree, what I would do is layer that lilac. I would propagate it. And I have a video that will show you how to do that. Once I have a rooted cutting off the tree, I will then move that to the new location, plant it, and it'll grow pretty quickly because rooted layering pieces are really easy to move compared to moving this old lilac. Now, this picture here shows what this looks like in summer. It's a beautiful little plant, and this is what we want. But this is a plant that needs full sun, and it just doesn't do well in shady conditions. So sometimes we just have to get rid of these plants. You might think somebody screwed up here when they first planted this, and yeah, that argument can be made. But if we go back 20 years, that big tree was not that big. And we had two trees here. We had a small tree and a lilac beside it. They were fine. Years go on, and now we have to change the landscape. There's nothing wrong with taking that tree out now. It's done its job. Here's another problem I see a lot. And I'm not really talking about the weeds here. They're a minor problem. And I'm also not talking about the fact that this hasn't been mulched. I much prefer this to be mulched. But the real problem here are these green leaves coming up. These are suckers from the main tree. These have to be taken out. They're trying to grow and become big trees. And we don't want that. We want all the energy to go into the main tree. Now, what the average person does is they come along and just cut these off. And one of the rules of pruning you have to understand is that every time you make a cut, you create 2 or 3 new branches. That's how woody plants behave. You make a cut, and they respond by making 2 or 3 new branches. So what happens here is the person comes along and cuts these off. Next year, you have 2 to 3 times as many of these, and you come along and cut those off. And you do that year after year, and before you know it, you have such a mess down here, you got a major problem. Here's another picture of some that are a little larger, but this is exactly the same problem. What you want to do here is not cut them off. You want to dig down in the soil and find out where they start. If these are true suckers, they will start off the roots of the tree and then cut them as far back as you can, right to the root. You don't want any little stub left. In fact, sometimes I take a knife and actually scrape that bud off. If you don't do that, they'll just come back. Here's another one of these standard lilacs. Now, this one is growing in a lot more sun and is quite happy, and you can see lots of growth on it. Now, there are really 2 problems here. One is that it's starting to lean a little bit. You really want to correct these. These trees look much better if they're straight up and down. So what you can do here is put in a stake, get a string attached to it, and slowly heave it in the direction it needs to go so it looks straight. And then leave it there for a year or two, and then remove the stake, and the tree will be much better off. The other issue here is that it's grown really well. So this is later in summer. So in spring, it started growing and making buds and flowering. We had a nice display. And then for the rest of the summer, it just keeps growing. And this is one of the downsides of these kinds of trees, is that they need annual pruning. Now you can leave the pruning here until late winter, early spring, but I would come along then and trim all these branches back. Now lilacs are a little different than other shrubs. So lilacs tend to make flowers on old wood. That means that in late summer, the buds have already been formed here. And most of the buds are grown at the tips of these stems. So if we trim this in late winter, we're actually going to cut off a lot of the buds. So the best thing to do with this kind of plant is to prune it soon after it flowers, get it into the shape you want, and then leave it until after it blooms. Now that advice is for the benefit of us gardeners who want to see lots of flowers. As far as the tree is concerned, the best time to prune it is late winter. But we like flowers, so from our point of view, the best time to prune this is actually right after flowering. Here's a little front yard garden with a couple evergreens, a couple stones, and in the middle here we have a lot of dead branches. I mean, what's going on with this thing? So this looks like a cedar. That's what we call it around here. It's actually an arborvitae, but the common name is cedar. This dead wood in here is probably a result of too much shade. These are sun-loving plants, and if they get taller, the top part stays green. The outer edges that are getting the sun stay green, but the areas that are not getting enough sun start to die out. Not all evergreens will regrow after we prune them. That's different than deciduous plants. Like if I go to a deciduous plant, the maples and the lilacs we've been talking about, I can cut those almost anywhere and new growth will start. That's not true for most evergreen. And cedars are like that. If I go in here and clean this out and hope it regrows green, it's just not going to happen. Now right beside this we have a yew. And the yew is an unusual evergreen in that I can do any kind of pruning I want to that and it's going to regrow green. I could literally cut it to the ground and it will regrow. But that's not what most evergreens do. Certainly not most of the junipers, pines, the spruces, and so on. You have to be very careful how you prune those. You have to see green needles once you're finished pruning, otherwise it won't regrow. So what do we do here? How do we fix this problem? Well, it's not really a problem we can fix very well. Pruning is not going to help this. This front area here is always going to be brown with dead stems. Now we can prune out the dead stuff, but we're still going to have a brown hole. It's not going to be improved with pruning. Now sometimes we can take a different approach and take one of these branches and prune it into a completely different form. Here's another standard. Now this standard only has green at the top. It doesn't have it near the bottom. This is quite an old tree now, and it's growing really well. You may or may not like this. It's a style that's not appealing to everybody. But since we're pruning out the bottom part, the dead part, it doesn't look quite so bad. So that's one option. Now going back to the original picture, what I would do here is probably take the shrub out. This shrub is past its prime. It's starting to get a bit tall. It's certainly looking ugly. Someone keeps pruning this into a kind of a flat shape, but it's really not enhancing the landscape. I would yank it and put something else in. A little side comment that has nothing to do with pruning. Everybody likes rocks in their garden, so at some point someone put in these 3 little rocks and a couple more in the back. Those don't do anything to the landscape. I would take those out too and just replace them with something that looks good. Whatever kind of plant you like. It could be another lower shrub, could be flowering plants, it could be all kinds of things. There's no way that pruning is going to fix this problem. Now, if we take this out, we're actually creating a new problem because this arborvitae is growing up against the yew. And I can guarantee you that when we take the arborvitae out, we're going to have this big hole in the yew. Now, as I said, yews will grow back, and so they will fill in that space, but it's going to take a number of years before the yew looks good too. So one of the advices I have is when you have two evergreens close together like this, keep some space between them. Keep pruning them so you get some light between them, and then you won't have this long-term problem. Here's a look at another Korean lilac and a different way to prune it. So this one is growing as a shrub. You can see it has multi-stems coming out of the ground. The pruner here keeps making this ball. That's fine. It looks great. In summer it does flower a little bit. It doesn't flower great because the pruning keeps cutting the flower buds off, but it's not a bad looking shrub. The problem with this pruning is that if you look at the tips of these branches, there's lots and lots of tiny little branches. Remember what I said earlier is that whenever you make a cut, you create 2 or 3 new branches. So what's happening here is that they cut it into a ball. Each cut turns into 2 or 3 branches. They cut it back into a ball. Each one of those grows into 2 or 3 branches. So now we have 9 branches, and so on and so on. In the outer edge of this shrub, the branches get so congested they can't grow properly, so everything is tiny, thin little branches. So if you like the globe shape, then when you prune, you want to prune back much farther every 2 or 3 years. Prune back to thick stems and then let it grow again in size. Do that for 2 or 3 years and then cut it right back again. If you keep only cutting the tips, you'll end up with very weak branches at the tips. All right, one last shrub I'd like to look at. What we're looking at here is a standard lilac. The lower branches have been removed, so only the top leaves are there. That's okay, they look good like that. In fact, this is a great pruning technique for shrubs that have really nice looking stems because they are either colored stems or they're exfoliating bark on them. Now, quite honestly, the lilac stems aren't that pretty, so that's not a big advantage for this plant. But for instance, this might have been a 7 Suns shrub, and the bark is really nice and exfoliating. So I limb them up like this. I only have leaves and branches at the top so I can see the stems at the bottom. The other reason for pruning this way is that you can now place a different shrub, a lower shrub, in front of it, so you have 2 plants in the same spot. And I'm okay with that. I don't see a problem with the lilac. But there is a problem developing here. To the left of the lilac, we have another evergreen, and I suspect these are Leyland cypress. Now around here, everybody calls them cedars, even though they're not cedars. And they're not arborvitae. Arborvitae and the Leyland cypress are different plants but look very similar. In any case, this is an evergreen that's very full looking, but it doesn't like shade either. The lilac is now shading these green evergreen. If we leave it like this, the evergreen is going to start. If we leave it like this, the lilac will shade the evergreen too much and will start having dead branches where the 2 meet. Remember what I said earlier is we want space between them. We want light to get in between 2 shrubs. We don't want them touching. Now, since the evergreens take a long time to grow this big and they're looking fairly nice there, and in this case they're used as a wall to hide the area in the backyard of this house from the street, what I would do is reduce the size of the lilac. And quite honestly, the lilac probably should be taken out. Now, for the next couple years, we can just simply trim back the left side of the lilac, reduce the size of it so that the evergreen grows properly. Udemy. So it's a pretty inexpensive online course that you can take any time of the year. I'll put a link to that course in the description below. I hope that gives you some insights into some specific cases of pruning, why you should do them and how to do them. But I haven't covered everything about pruning, so if you'd like to learn to prune properly, consider taking my course. My pruning course is on Udemy, and I'll put a link to that in the description. It's an online course, it's pretty inexpensive, and you can take it anytime you want and go back and review the course later on. And I think that's really important. You want to review this course every time you go out and prune. Now, if you'd prefer not to take the course and just watch some more of my free videos, that's fine.